The 88mm gun destroyed more Allied tanks than all German panzers combined. But here's what most people don't know. It wasn't even designed to fight tanks. The German 88 started life as an anti-aircraft gun, built to shoot down bombers flying at 20,000 feet. Yet by the end of World War II, Allied tank crews feared this weapon more than the legendary Tiger tanks or Panthers that dominate war movies. Today, we're going to show you how a defensive weapon became the deadliest tank killer of the war, why German gun crews achieved impossible kill ratios with a weapon they were never trained to use, and the psychological burden that haunted both the crews who operated it and the tank crews who faced it. We have one story at the end that shows how the technological advantage of this weapon created moral dilemmas that lasted long after the war ended. By 1939, Germany had developed what many considered the finest anti-aircraft gun in the world. The 88mm Flak gun could fire shells to altitudes of over 30,000 feet with deadly accuracy, protecting German cities and industrial targets from Allied bombing raids. Its high-velocity performance and precise targeting systems made it the backbone of German air defense. In the early years of the war, German tank crews were already dominating their opponents. The Panzer IIIs and IVs, with their superior optics, training and tactics, were outfighting British Crusaders and American Grants across the North African desert. But German commanders were always looking for ways to maximize their advantages and minimize their losses. It was in the North African desert that battlefield opportunity created tactical innovation. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was already achieving remarkable success against British armor with their superior tanks, but the open desert terrain, with its clear sight lines and long engagement distances, presented an unexpected opportunity. German 88 anti-aircraft crews, positioned near the front lines to protect against Allied air attacks, made a discovery that would revolutionize tank warfare. Their high-velocity guns could destroy any Allied tank at ranges that made return fire impossible. What started as battlefield improvisation quickly became official doctrine. Anti-aircraft crews trained to track fast-moving bombers found that stationary or slow-moving tanks were almost impossibly easy targets. This wasn't born from desperation, but from German tactical efficiency. Why risk valuable panzers and trained crews in close combat when 88s could eliminate threats from extreme range with near-perfect accuracy? The 88mm gun was a technological marvel that combined several advantages into one devastating package. Its muzzle velocity of over 2,700 feet per second gave it armor penetration capabilities that far exceeded any tank gun of the early war period. While a German Panzer IV's main gun could penetrate about 60 millimeters of armor at 500 meters, the 88 could punch through over 100 millimeters of armor at twice that distance. But the gun's effectiveness wasn't just about raw power. German engineers had equipped it with some of the finest optical equipment in the world. The range-finding and targeting systems allowed crews to accurately engage targets at distances where Allied tanks couldn't even see the gun position. In the clear desert air of North Africa, experienced 88 crews could identify and destroy enemy tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Operating the weapon required a crew of 7 to 10 men, significantly larger than a typical tank crew. The gun commander directed the engagement, calling out targets and ranges. The gunner operated the traversing and elevation controls, while the loader and ammunition handlers kept a steady supply of shells feeding into the weapon. 2 men operated the range-finding equipment, while others managed the ammunition supply and prepared backup rounds. Unlike tank crews who were confined in their vehicles, 88 crews operated in the open, which made them both more vulnerable and more effective. They had unobstructed vision of the battlefield and could coordinate more easily, but they were also exposed to artillery fire and air attacks. The gun itself was mounted on a stable platform that could be quickly positioned for optimal fields of fire. The tactical employment was devastatingly simple. Crews would position their guns on ridgelines or in concealed defensive positions with clear fields of fire across likely tank approach routes. They would wait until Allied tanks moved into their engagement zone, then systematically destroy them one by one before the tanks could close to effective range for return fire. Picture this. You're a 20-year-old Sherman tank driver advancing across the North African desert in 1942. Your crew has been told that German tanks are nearby, but intelligence reports suggest they're still several miles away. You're scanning the horizon through your periscope when suddenly there's a tremendous crash and your tank shudders to a halt. The gunner is screaming that the main gun is destroyed. Smoke is pouring into the fighting compartment. You have no idea what hit you or where it came from. That was the reality for thousands of Allied tank crews who encountered the German 88. The gun was so effective at long range that many crews never even saw their attackers. They would be advancing across what appeared to be empty terrain when tanks would start exploding around them with no visible enemy in sight. From the German perspective, operating an 88 was like having a technological crystal ball. Through their superior optics, crews could watch Allied tank formations approaching from distances where they were completely safe from return fire. The psychological advantage was enormous. While Allied tank crews were straining to spot German positions, the 88 crews could take their time, calculate precise range and bearing, and engage targets with almost guaranteed success. The engagement sequence was methodical and deadly. The gun commander would identify priority targets, usually starting with command tanks or the most threatening opponents. The rangefinder operator would determine exact distance while the gunner laid the weapon on target. The loader would select the appropriate ammunition type, usually armor-piercing for tanks or high-explosive for softer targets. When the gun fired, the sound was distinctive and terrifying. Allied troops learned to recognize the sharp crack of the high-velocity 88, different from the deeper boom of tank guns or the whistle of artillery. The shell traveled so fast that impact occurred almost simultaneously with the sound of firing, giving targets no time to take evasive action. In major engagements like the Battle of Kasserine Pass, single 88 guns would achieve kill ratios that seemed impossible. One gun position might destroy 5 or 6 Allied tanks in a single engagement, while remaining completely undetected. The psychological effect on Allied crews was devastating. Tank commanders became reluctant to advance across open ground, knowing that invisible death could reach out and touch them at any moment. German crews described the experience as both exhilarating and unsettling. The technical superiority was obvious, but many gun commanders reported feeling conflicted about the one-sided nature of the engagements. They were destroying enemies who couldn't effectively fight back, more like target practice than combat. But the 88's dominance came with a human cost that extended far beyond simple casualty statistics. Unlike the face-to-face combat that infantry experienced, or even the closer engagements between tanks, 88 crews killed at distances where their targets seemed almost abstract. They could watch Allied tank crews bail out of burning vehicles, could see men running across the desert trying to escape the destruction. The distance created a strange detachment from the human consequences of their actions. The crews became priority targets for Allied forces, in a way that created constant psychological pressure. Artillery spotters learned to recognize the distinctive muzzle flash and smoke signature of the 88. Fighter bombers were specifically briefed to hunt for gun positions. Allied infantry units were trained in techniques for eliminating 88 crews. The life expectancy of a gun crew dropped dramatically once their position was identified by Allied forces. The weapon's effectiveness also created moral dilemmas that troubled many crews long after the war ended. Some gun commanders described moments when they could watch enemy tank crews escaping from burning vehicles, but had to decide whether to eliminate them with high explosive shells or let them flee. The technological superiority of their weapon put ordinary soldiers in positions to make life and death decisions about enemies who had no way to fight back effectively. It wasn't combat in any traditional sense, it was more like having absolute power over helpless opponents from a safe distance. The statistics tell the story of this psychological burden. Gun crews that survived the war reported much higher rates of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many described recurring dreams about the faces they could see through their rangefinders, the tank crews they had killed from distances so great that the enemies never even knew where death was coming from. As Allied losses mounted, military commanders realized that the 88 had become the primary threat to armored operations. The response was systematic and eventually effective, but it came at a tremendous cost in both equipment and human lives. Artillery became the primary countermeasure. Allied forward observers were trained to quickly locate 88 positions and call in immediate counter-battery fire. Counter-battery fire became a priority mission for Allied artillery units. The goal was to saturate suspected gun positions with high explosive shells before the 88 crews could relocate. Air power proved even more effective. Fighter bombers like the British Typhoon and American Thunderbolt were equipped with rockets and bombs specifically for hunting 88 positions. Pilots learned to identify the geometric patterns of gun emplacements and the telltale signs of concealed positions. Once spotted from the air, an 88 position rarely survived more than a few minutes. Allied tank tactics also evolved to counter the weapon's range advantage. Crews learned to use terrain masking, advancing through valleys and depressions that blocked sight lines from elevated gun positions. Smoke screens became standard equipment for obscuring movement across open ground. Night operations increased dramatically as Allied commanders sought to avoid the 88's optical advantages. Perhaps most importantly, Allied weapons technology began catching up. The British 17-pounder gun and American 76mm and 90mm weapons gave Allied tanks the ability to engage German positions at longer ranges. By 1944, the technological advantage that had made the 88 so dominant was beginning to erode. German crews had to adapt to this changing battlefield reality. As the war progressed and Allied air supremacy and artillery superiority became overwhelming, the shoot-and-scoot tactics became essential for survival. Gun crews would fire a few rounds from one position, then quickly displace to alternate firing positions before Allied artillery could respond. Camouflage and concealment became increasingly sophisticated as German crews learned that detection meant almost certain destruction. By the end of World War II, the 88mm gun had destroyed an estimated 15,000 Allied tanks and other armoured vehicles. No other single weapon system came close to that level of effectiveness against armoured targets. But the true legacy of the 88 extends far beyond its battlefield statistics. The weapon fundamentally changed how military planners thought about anti-tank warfare. The lesson that a well-positioned, high-velocity gun could dominate tank formations influenced post-war military doctrine around the world. Modern anti-tank guided missiles and advanced tank guns trace their conceptual lineage back to the principles demonstrated by the German 88. For the gun crews who operated these weapons, the war's end brought mixed feelings. The technological superiority they had wielded was undeniable, but so was the reality that they had become priority targets as Allied forces adapted their tactics. Allied tank crews who survived encounters with the 88 carried their own trauma. The helplessness of being engaged by an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't locate, and couldn't effectively fight back against created a unique form of combat stress. Many veterans reported that the sound of the 88's distinctive crack remained embedded in their memories decades after the war. But perhaps the most important legacy is how the 88 demonstrated the battlefield impact of superior technology. The weapon showed that technological advantage could be just as decisive as numerical superiority or tactical skill. It proved that a well-designed weapon system, properly employed, could fundamentally change the balance of power on the battlefield. The 88 proved that sometimes the most feared weapon isn't the one that looks the most impressive or gets the most attention in movies. Sometimes it's the weapon that gives ordinary soldiers extraordinary power over life and death, power that comes with a psychological cost that can last a lifetime. If you found this story worth remembering, help us honor more forgotten aspects of military history by subscribing. There are countless examples of how technology and humanity intersect in warfare, stories that deserve to be told with the complexity and respect they merit.